some expectations prior to the launch of this with all of the equipment that they had assembled and all the training that they had gone through in the NATO, that they really expected to have punched through one or possibly more of the main defense belts of the first defensive belt of the Russian defense within 5 to 10 days. And then they thought they would be moving more to the south, and then perhaps by the end of the month be down to Melitopol down on the Azov coast. I think that was the general hope and expectation. And yet after now 14 days into this offensive, they have still yet to even reach the first belt of the Russian defense, and they haven't even made it through the security zone in most places, and they absorbed enormous casualties in both personnel and equipment. And I just don't see how this does anything except just completely chew through what this offensive capacity that Ukraine put together. It's really hard to watch.
So it appears that the mystery of Ukraine's top officer, General Valery Zaluzhny, who has been absent from the battlefield for a while, and which has fueled much speculation as to his whereabouts and his mortality, has been finally answered. Well, I would say somewhat answered, as we still haven't seen any live footage from him. In fact, the last live video I have seen from him was in February 2023. But nevertheless, Washington Post has published a very eye-opening article today, the 30th of June, where they claim to have interviewed General Zaluzhny about the progress of the Ukraine counteroffensive. Although he is a known Banderite, I always admire him and most military men for their candor about the situation on the front lines, as opposed to many politicians who spread propaganda for their own motives. And when you listen to his responses in this interview, it paints a dire picture for Ukraine. From being outgunned in artillery, lacking necessary air support for its ground attacks, and perhaps most interestingly, an admission that the Prigozhin march that occurred this weekend has had, in quotations, no noticeable change on the battlefield. And yes, that is a direct quote. The overall picture seems quite bleak for Ukraine. But before we get into the video today, please consider hitting the subscribe button and help the algorithm push this channel. So without further ado, let's get into it. For Ukraine's counteroffensive to progress faster, General Valery Zaluzhny, the top officer in Ukraine's armed forces, says he needs more of every weapon. And he is telling anyone who will listen, including his American counterpart, General Mark A. Milley, as recently as Wednesday, that he needs those resources now. In a rare, wide-ranging interview with the Washington Post, Zaluzhny expressed frustration that while his biggest Western backers would never launch an offensive without air superiority, Ukraine still has not received modern fighter jets, but is expected to rapidly take back territory from the occupying Russians. Remember that interview clip with Scott Ritter, where he said U.S. officials like Mark Milley are guilty of criminal negligence for sending Ukrainians into prepared Russian defense lines without air support. So now this is corroborated by General Valery Zaluzhny.
If this was an American counteroffensive and the Americans suffered these casualties, Congress would hold a hearing and General Milley would come through and talk about the training that has been prepared, and he would be court-martialed for being criminally negligent, because what he has done is taken people that we know are insufficiently trained for the task, and we put them in combat anyways. General Milley is a liar. He is a criminal. He deserves to be prosecuted. And I would hope that the Ukrainians at some point in time, when this is all said and done, open up a case against him in the International Criminal Court. Because to send these Ukrainian soldiers into those Russian defenses with equipment they don't know how to use, with tactics they don't know how to employ, with an operational doctrine that is broken, because at a minimum you require a modicum of air support. There is no air support. The Russians are slaughtering these people before they even get near the front line. And as they get near the front line, helicopters going up. You know how many helicopters the Ukrainians have shot down? Russian helicopters in a very intensive combat zone? Zero, which means they don't have air defense because the Russians have taken it apart. This is murder.
His troops also should be firing at least as many artillery shells as their enemy, Zaluzhny said, but have been outshot tenfold at times because of limited resources, an admission that Ukraine is outgunned in terms of artillery as much as 10-1. And we know the statistics say that most of the injuries in this war come from artillery. What does that mean for who is suffering more casualties? So it pisses me off, Zaluzhny said, when he hears that Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive in the country's east and south has started slower than expected, an opinion publicly expressed by Western officials and military analysts, and also by President Volodymyr Zelensky. This is not a show, Zaluzhny said Wednesday. Every day, every meter is given by blood. Without being supplied fully, these plans are not feasible at all. So this is the point that has been made several times. They are launching these counteroffensives not when they're ready, not when their troops are properly supplied and trained, but because they have to, for PR reasons, because they need to justify to their Western backers that they are capable of making gains on the battlefield so that they can attract additional aid and weapons. This is not a strategy to winning a war. This is not a military sound decision to launch a counteroffensive. It is all for PR, and it is doomed to fail in my opinion. The questions that weigh on him daily: when will Ukraine's Western partners provide the arms he needs, particularly more ammunition and the F-16s? And how can he be expected to get the job done without them? Zaluzhny said he relays his concerns to Milley, whom he has grown to deeply admire and considers a friend, several times per week in conversations that can last hours. He shares them absolutely, and I think he can help me get rid of those worries, Zaluzhny said, adding that he told Milley on Wednesday how many more artillery shells he needs per month. In these conversations, Zaluzhny is frank about the consequences. We have an agreement, 24/7, we are in touch. So sometimes I can call up and say, if I don't get 100,000 shells in a week, 1,000 people will die. Remember when Mark Milley, after the 4 counteroffensives, which Western media heralded as great victories, but I think suffered a similar fate to this counteroffensive, launching it prematurely and suffering massive casualties. General Mark Milley said, this is as far as the Ukrainians can go.
But Kherson and Kharkiv, physically, geographically, are relatively small compared to the whole. So that the military task of militarily kicking the Russians physically out of Ukraine is a very difficult task. So in terms of probability, the probability of a Ukrainian military victory defined as kicking the Russians out of all of Ukraine, to include what they define or what they claim as Crimea, the probability of that happening anytime soon is not high.
And he was nearly lynched on the media for more or less admitting that Ukraine cannot achieve the objectives. And in short order, he changed his tune to fit the narrative of the Western globalists. Ahead of the long-planned counteroffensive, Ukraine for the first time received Western battle tanks, including German-made Leopards and infantry fighting vehicles. Those tanks and fighting vehicles debuted on the battlefield when the counteroffensive kicked off earlier this month. Several have already been destroyed, Zaluzhny acknowledged, adding that we didn't get Leopards to ride in parades or have politicians or celebrities take pictures with them. I think that's a subtle jab at the Zelensky regime. I remember the videos where Reznikov was parading in the Challenger 2 tanks and making
marvelous when Secretary of Defense of the United Kingdom. It's a very good stuff. Thank you very much from Ukraine to the United Kingdom.
They came here for the war, and a leopard on the battlefield is not a leopard but a target. Now listen to this part, and I've heard many Western analysts say this paragraph right here. Ukraine has not yet launched the main thrust of its offensive, analysts say. Why are you doing an interview with General Zaluzhny, who's allegedly alive and on the ground, who's the best person to give analysis about the counteroffensive? And in the middle of your article, you switch from quoting General Zaluzhny and returning to quoting unnamed anonymous analysts. To me, this sounds like a lot of coup and propaganda. I want to know what General Zaluzhny says about this. Does he think that Ukraine has not launched the main thrust of the counteroffensive? But it continues. Not all of its specially prepared forces have been committed to the front line, and those that have still seem to be probing for weak spots in Russia's defenses. Roughly 50 square miles in total have been liberated, Ukrainian officials have said. Again, Ukrainian officials, Western officials, analysts, all of this is taken with a grain of salt. I want to hear what Zaluzhny has to say. But Zaluzhny also pointed to NATO forces' own doctrine, which parallels Russia's, he said. That calls for air superiority before launching ground-based, deep-reaching operations. If you read in between the lines here, he is criticizing the West and the Zelensky administration for the slaughter of all these troops on the front line in the counteroffensive. That's what he's saying here. And here's a quotation. And Ukraine, moving to offensive operations, should follow which doctrine, he asks. NATO's? The Russian Federation's? Or is that none of your business? You have your own doctrine, You have tanks. You have some cannons. You have some fighting vehicles. You can do it. What is that? This is a direct jab to all those who sanctioned this counteroffensive. He's basically saying both NATO doctrine and Russian doctrine says you do not launch a counteroffensive without air support. But they told the Ukrainian army you can do it because you have tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. And he's asking, what the hell is that? In his command post, Zaluzhny has a screen that shows him everything in the air at any given moment. The aviation from NATO countries at Ukraine's western border, his own planes in the sky over Ukraine, and Russia's on the eastern edges. In quotations, let's just say the number of aircraft that are on duty near our western borders is twice as much as the number of Russian aircraft devastating our positions. That's a quote. Why can't we take at least a third of it from there and move it here? Zaluzhny asked. Because Russia's more modern fleet of Su-35s have a far superior radar and missile range. Ukraine's older jets cannot compete. Troops on the ground are easily targeted as a result. Here's another jab. Nobody is saying that tomorrow we should rearm and get 120 planes, Zaluzhny said. Why? I do not need 120 planes. I am not going to threaten the whole world. A very limited number would be enough, but they are needed. Because there is no other way, because the enemy is using a different generation of aviation. So not only are they outgunned, but there's a wide technology gap between what Ukraine uses as weapons and what the Russians use. It's like we'd go on the offensive with bows and arrows now and everyone would say, are you crazy? But with this question, no. If anyone thinks that Ukraine's counteroffensive got a lucky boost last weekend when Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin led a mutiny of mercenary forces on an assault toward Moscow before halting the advance, Zaluzhny is not so sure. This is contradicting the entire Western narrative that Putin's grip on power has been weakened by the Prigozhin debacle. This is why I like to hear what the military men say. They are more likely to tell the truth. They are more pragmatic and realistic because the reality on the battlefield is always in their face, not the politicians who sit behind desks far away and spread what they want to spread for their own agenda. Prigozhin's Wagner forces had already exited the front line after claiming the eastern city of Bakhmut a month ago, Zaluzhny said. So there was no noticeable change on the battlefield as the rebellion took place. We didn't feel that the defense got weaker somewhere or anything, he said. And I'm going to end this video with this quote from General Zaluzhny. I have a lot of fears, and Wagner is among them, Zaluzhny said. And they're not the only ones. If we start talking about it now, my head will spin. Our task is to prepare for the worst and most possible scenarios, and we will try to minimize the possible consequences of what could be.